You're listening to the B&H Photography Podcast. For over 40 years, B&H has been the professional source for photography, video, audio, and more. For your favorite gear, news, and reviews, visit us at bnh.com or download the B&H app to your iPhone or Android device. Now here's your host, Alan Weitz.
Greetings and welcome to the B&H Photography Podcast. Today's episode is definitely celebratory and hopefully inspirational. For some, photography can be a solitary enterprise. For others, photography is a visual conversation between a small circle of people, perhaps friends, and maybe even other photographers. But today's guests have figured out a way to use their photo skills to bridge social divides and encourage dialogue between segments of society that might not otherwise cross paths, let alone say good morning to one another when they actually do cross paths. John Harris and I are very pleased to welcome Michael Skoler, John Noltner, and Tonika Johnson to the B&H Photography Podcast to talk about projects each of them have taken on and what these projects have in common with one another. In the first half of the program, we're going to be speaking with Michael Skoler about the Weave Project. We'll also be speaking with John Noltner about his project, A Piece of My Mind. And after a short break, we're going to catch up with Tonika Johnson and learn about the Folded Map Project, a long-term project that approaches the idea of community from a uniquely urban perspective. Welcome to each of you, and thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here.
Hi.
It's good to be with you.
Terrific. Welcome here. Michael Skoler is Communications Director for Weave, the Social Fabric Project, which is part of the Aspen Institute in Washington, D.C. If you want big things done, Mike's the guy you call. He's a former NPR correspondent. He's also responsible for creating the first national crowdsourcing network for public radio newsrooms. As president of Louisville Public Media, he focused on expanding its community connections and the diversity of its staff, its board, and its audiences. Joining Michael is photographer John Noltner. In addition to a bustling photo career, John founded A Piece of My Mind, a multimedia project that includes photo exhibits, workshops, and lectures. The concept was simple. Ask people what peace means to them. But we're going to let John tell us more about this project and the collaboration between A Piece of My Mind and the Weave Project. Again, welcome, folks. And Michael, perhaps we can start by having you tell us a bit about Weave, the Social Fabric Project. How did it start, and what are some of its initiatives and its missions?
3 years ago, the Aspen Institute started the Weave Project with New York Times columnist David Brooks to tackle the problem of social trust. In the U.S., surveys now show that we're at an all-time low in trusting each other and in trusting our institutions. We live in a culture where people feel isolated, divided, and self-centered, and we see the results of that all around us. There's been a steady rise over the last couple of decades in suicides and drug addiction. Measures of mental health and happiness have been dropping. We face political gridlock where we demonize or cancel those who disagree with us rather than listen to understand them and perhaps find common ground. We have persistent racial and economic inequity after years of programs designed to try to solve them. And we seem unable to tackle huge common problems from homelessness to climate change. So the Aspen Institute has a mission to create a free, just, and equitable society. And we realize that we can't create that world that we want without trust between people and across the differences in our backgrounds, life experiences, and our beliefs. So yes, we need programs and policies. We need to change our institutions. But we also have to build a healthier culture where people feel welcome, valued, and connected, where we have trust in each other and we prioritize our relationships and not just our own achievements. The Weave team started making trips around the country to visit places, some in big cities and others in small towns that seem to have trust. And we found people in those places who are just quietly, in their own ways, bringing their communities together, seeing the dignity in others, no matter how different they were, and building relationships in all sorts of ways, whether it was trying to talk about mental illness after, a woman had her son kill himself, or creating a culture of trust in neighborhoods where poverty had kind of isolated everyone. These folks were doing whatever they needed to do to bring people together, to get things done, and to make life better in their communities. So we call those folks weavers, and our organization, Weave, found our path to change the nation. We exist to support those folks, those weavers, and to inspire more people to become weavers. We believe that if we're going to change our country, it has to start in our neighborhoods, not in DC. It has to start with people connecting, caring for, and trusting each other. We have to shift our hearts and not just our minds. So Weave's programs are all about finding, connecting, and supporting these people we call Weavers. We have an online community where Weavers across the country talk, they share their experiences and advice, they give skill workshops, they learn about resources and funding that can advance their work, and they find partners to collaborate with. We just launched one project called the Weaver Awards in Baltimore, Maryland, with a local bank, M&T Bank, which gives grants to people who are creating relationships and trust in their neighborhoods. And you don't have to be a nonprofit to get an award. You can be an individual who happens to hold barbecues to bring folks together. We have one of our awardees who does that. Or you might be someone involving your neighbors in fixing up a park or welcoming new immigrants who have arrived and are living in your community. So Weave plans to spread these Weaver Awards to communities across the country. And we also tell the stories of Weavers to inspire others to adopt this kind of weaving approach to life. We led a social media campaign using the hashtag Weaving Community during the pandemic, and that reached over 20 million people and engaged 461,000 folks. So we have many stories about how people are weaving their community on our website with ideas for folks on how to get started bringing people together. We have a newsletter on how to get involved that highlights our other programs, and people can subscribe or find out more at our website, weareweavers.org. That's weareweavers.org.
How long has this organization been in existence now?
It was started 3 years ago, and the first year was really this listening tour of just going to communities, from rural communities in Nebraska to communities out in Oregon and California to Chicago, the Englewood neighborhood in Chicago, just meeting people who were trying to weave their communities together and learning from them. And then after that first year, for the last couple of years, we've slowly been figuring out the programs that can support these people doing this incredible work, just bringing folks together and creating kind of trust and a sense of dignity for all.
How exactly is photography used in this project? What are some of these stories you can tell us with that?
Well, photos are, a window into the soul of our culture. They reveal much more than just what's happening. They show what people are feeling. They show they give a sense of why people are acting as they do. So photography, like all the arts, has almost a direct channel into our feelings. It reminds us that we have a shared story, that we're more alike than we are different. And photographers, use photography in many different ways, but the ones who want to be weavers of community, they have this powerful tool to help us see the humanity in each other. So Weave works to support photographers and other storytellers who are giving us this new narrative of connection rather than the current narrative of division and isolation and separation. And you've got two of those Weaver photographers on the show today.
Can you talk a little bit about how photographers might reach out to Weave or how these projects come about? And John Noltner, feel free to chime in, because obviously a piece of my mind has been affiliated and worked through Weave. But are there submissions that can be made? And is this kind of process formalized at any degree?
No, it's pretty informal, partly because we're developing it, and partly because, we have an online community of people who are weaving their communities in all sorts of different ways. So, we were able to find John. I was aware of Tonika and actually invited her to a gathering we had a few years ago, but she wasn't able to come. But we're constantly looking for people who are using their tools to bring communities together, and then we're inviting them to be part of this community. We call it the We Are Weavers community. It's an online community, and through that community, we're able to both connect people to opportunities like this one, talking on the podcast. We're able to highlight folks resources that they might need, from money to expertise for projects they're doing. And a lot of the folks in our community are artists of different sorts, and a number of them are photographers. And so when we see a project that's doing good work, we try to use the access we have and the tools and connections we have to try to kind of amplify their work and connect them to resources. So it's still informal, and we're still figuring things out. And I think the more folks who join our community, the more photographers who join and start talking among themselves about how they can work together to weave their communities through their art will give us ideas on how we can, be supportive of them and figure out kind of ways to work together.
Wonderful. And John, to you, a question. I mean, photography can take all kinds of forms, and often there are people put up photo shows of the photos they've taken of another place or of another culture. And I think a lot of us feel that only goes so far when you're just kind of demonstrating. Tell us a bit how you use your photography towards these purposes, and is really, as it is in my opinion, like storytelling is really at the heart of what brings people together, photography or otherwise. So if you're able to tell a story or to let somebody else tell their story, you're kind of halfway there, is my feeling. But how do you feel about that subject when it comes to your own photos?
Yeah, I agree with that. And let me just start in shorthand by saying most everything Michael Skoler just said about the Weave Project, ditto for a piece of my mind. These are our goals. This just our methodologies differ, and not even so much. My training was in journalism, and so I was actually trained as a writer, and so I've come to call myself a storyteller, and sometimes that happens in words, and sometimes that happens in images. And for a piece of my mind, it slowly evolved as a combination of the two. And I felt like I had a lot I wanted to say as a photographer, but really, my thoughts were paled in comparison to the people who I encountered. And so what I really wanted to do was use my skill set to amplify other voices, to be able to offer a platform for other people to be heard. And so very much it's a journalistic pursuit. At this point, we've traveled over 100,000 miles across the country, building conversations with people from all different backgrounds, asking them, what does peace mean to you? How do you work towards it in your life? And we sit down and we do a recorded interview. And and then because I'm a photographer, we do a portrait. And really, the project was rooted around the word peace, but over time it has evolved. And that question, what does peace mean to you, really is just used to access all sorts of other ideas, to really tap into what's on people's hearts and what's close to them and what they believe strongly in. And so it opens these opportunities to have conversations about race, about gender, about faith, about international priorities and national policies, and more than anything else, a piece of my mind has become a project rooted in deep listening. And so we share these stories in any number of ways. We've got 4 traveling exhibits that go around the country. We've got now 3 books that share these stories, and we lead workshops and lectures all built around the notion that storytelling can help bridge divides and build community. So we'll use these stories not to tell people the secret meaning of peace, but instead we use those stories to encourage people to recognize that they're a part of the process, and to encourage them to foster dialogue around conflict resolution, around civic responsibility, and around social change.
Something I'm curious about is what was the most startling or eye-opening definition of the word peace that you heard to date? I mean, because we all have our idea what peace is, and most of them are probably very similar. But every once in a while, somebody will come out with something that just is from a totally different perspective. Does anything stand out in mind?
Yeah, a lot of them stand out, and the beauty of the project is when I started this, I sort of had the impression that I could work on this for a few months or a couple of years, and then people would start repeating themselves, that we would run out of ways to talk about this concept. But what amazes me is that people bring their unique stories, they bring their personal experience to this, and there's a richness in those personal narratives that really help to illuminate these universal themes. And so, one of the stories that always strikes me is the story of Bud Welch, who lost his only child in the Oklahoma City bombing when Timothy McVeigh blew up the federal building in Oklahoma City. And
Yeah, yeah.
of course, he. Uh, Bud was broken. His world fell apart, and he wanted nothing more than for Timothy McVeigh to be executed. Just get him off the face of the earth and let me go on with my life the best I can. But then he saw a news clip of Tim McVeigh's father on TV, and he looked at it and he said, "Well, that guy is as wrecked as I am. His world changed in the same day that my world changed." And he decided then that he needed to reach out to Tim McVeigh's father. And it took a few years before he found the courage and before he found the opportunity. But eventually, he found himself at the kitchen table at the McVeigh family home with Tim McVeigh's father, all the family pictures hanging on the wall behind him, including a picture of Tim. And Bud says that that's when he realized he didn't want Tim McVeigh to die. And he started working against the execution of Timothy McVeigh. Um, he wasn't successful. McVeigh was executed pretty quickly in the way these processes usually work. But now Bud goes around the world working against capital punishment, having realized for him that he got no sense of peace. He got no sense of relief from the loss of one more life. And Bud shared a quote, and he said, that he realized that he was forgiving Tim, and he doesn't know how to teach that, but he knows that he went through the process. And he said, "I can tell you one thing, that forgiveness doesn't do a damn thing for the killer, but you totally free yourself. And that's where the peace comes from."
Oof.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I hate to ask such a
Oof.
kind of straightforward or a kind of practical question after that, but I'm kind of curious where when you do exhibit the works and the photos, where do you do that, and do you also hold events and lectures and workshops at the same time around the photos, so that it's more than just kind of looking and reading? You can then kind of take it from there and interact with people.
Yeah, that's right. We've got this whole range of programming, and really, we sort of operate outside of the typical gallery model. I mean, we've got 4 traveling exhibits, and the first one we produced is a typical gallery exhibit. It's stretched canvas prints that hang on a wall, and we do that in galleries. But we also have 3 exhibits that are made up out of portable display banners. So they're freestanding, they can install in any public space. And so very often we'll use them in community centers or schools or colleges or um, corporate lobbies, libraries, any public space that has open space. And it's really flexible how we install it. And, my favorite engagement is a week to a month long residency. And so what we'll do is we'll build conversations with workshops around these stories, and we'll use it to start dialogue within the community. But then we make it interactive as well, and we'll set up these portable studios. We just did this with the University of Minnesota last week. One studio day with first generation students, where we asked, what does it mean to graduate from college for you, your family, or your community? And the second with students from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King program at the university, where we asked students, how is Dr. King's legacy still relevant today? And so over the course of a day, we'll ask people to respond in 25 words or less. We'll shoot a black and white portrait of them, and we'll combine their words and their photos. Um, in this case, we did 150 portraits in a day, and then 150 portraits the next day. And the production turnaround is a little absurd, but we crushed those files over the next couple of days. And then just last night, we reflected those back to the community. And so what that does is it allows, in a really short period of time, it allows a community to articulate their mission, vision, and values in the world. And then when we share that back with the community, they're able to see themselves and their peers in new ways.
And can you speak a little bit about how you've worked with Weave and how that comes together? And we don't need to get into specifics and all, but how do you find funding for these and the people to staff and to make these events happen?
Yeah, so I'll back up to that first one and ask how we've worked with Weave in the past. And really, the first engagement where we partnered in some way with Weave was in 2020, last year. I'm in Minneapolis. At least that's where I used to be based out of. And when George Floyd was killed, it was just 11 miles north of my house. And I knew I needed to respond in some way with this project. If this project was rooted in deep listening, if it was rooted in challenging expectations and figuring out how to be a better ally in the world, I knew I had to at least be present and bear witness in some way. And so I went up to 38th in Chicago where this happened, and just to see it the first day. But the second day came back with a small lighting kit to simply produce a public series there. And we set up on the street and just asked people, what do you want to say? Just that simple. In the midst of the grieving, in the midst of the frustration, in the midst of the community gathering, we just wanted to listen. And so over that first week, we gathered 50 stories from the streets, and we shared those out as a video, and we've helped amplify that into their community. Eventually, we wound up finding a building north of 38th in Chicago, Our Savior's Lutheran Church, with this giant blank white wall. And over the course of 10 nights, we projected these images 20 feet by 30 feet as a public display, and a process of saying to the community and to the individuals, I see you, I hear you, and you matter. That process of deep listening.
And when did you project the images? Was it just right after?
It was toward the end of the summer.
Okay.
So it was probably late July, early August of last year.
Okay. All right.
And I'll add that was during the time that we were doing the hashtag Weaving Community campaign that I mentioned reached over 20 million people. And so, John's work was just perfect for the message we were trying to get out again and again throughout the pandemic and through the racial protests, that, we need to see each other, and we need to show up for each other in ways that aren't about necessarily doing what we think is good for someone, but by listening and seeing people and then serving in the ways we can based on what's needed. Many of the stories that we shared about beyond John's work, which was just beautiful about what was on people's minds, but many of the stories we shared were of people in the Twin Cities of Minnesota, going after, a night of protests and sometimes riots and cleaning up the streets. And we shared photographs of, people from all over the Twin Cities coming together to make sure that bags of food were getting into neighborhoods where the grocery stores had been closed because of the disturbances. And so our campaign was really just to kind of amplify what John and many others were doing, to just show up for other people and see them fully as people, and not judge whether, they were right or wrong, but just see them as people.
We're trying to understand diversity, and also then at the same time find universality within the multifaceted culture that we have. And how possible is that? How can you do that? And how do you find ways to do that? I'm just curious if you think, photography is a tool that can do that, and how you do that when you're using your tools.
Well, this is John, and I'll jump in on that. And for me, when I'm producing images, I have three audiences in mind. And the first audience is myself, because when I'm engaging with people, I wind up learning so much in the process. Photography is my tool to explore ideas, and it's my tool to explore relationships. And so I'm the first audience. The second audience is that person who I'm working with, who I'm photographing, because it's really important to me that there's an authenticity and an integrity to that experience, so that when they have left that photographic experience, that they feel seen and heard and valued. And then the third is the public, and you start losing a little bit of control about how the public is going to respond to things. But my hope is that this relationship, this little moment of energy, this exchange that I have with my subject, where I am able to, where we're able to sort of exchange some humanity, that this becomes evident and clear to the audience as well, and carries that sort of respect. And it requires integrity all through the process. So when I had found a publisher for my second book, who said, "Oh, we'd love to publish your book if you would just remove the voices of the gay and the lesbian people from it," I, I had to say, so you're asking me to take a project rooted in listening to everybody, whether you agree with them or not, and then remove the voices you disagree with. And they said, yeah. And I said, no. That would have gutted the integrity of the project. People had trusted me with their stories, and I was going to share them in their full, authentic selves. And so we wound up self-publishing that book as well, just to make sure that the integrity of those relationships was maintained.
I love this idea that that kernel of communication and trust and collaboration that you have with your subject, can carry its way over through the audience and through the public, and hopefully, and I think usually it does, people can read into that. And of course, people can read into anything, but you can really see that kernel of trust. And I love that idea. But when it comes to someone who is giving an opinion that perhaps you don't agree with, or is further to the left or further to the right than yours, is there editing involved in these things? Do you consider what's being said, and what if it is egregious and you just can't cotton to it? I mean, how do you handle these situations?
From time to time that does happen. And if it's, egregious is a really subjective term, but if it's something that doesn't square up with my understanding of the world, um, I'm going to enter into conversation about that, and I'll do it honestly, and I'll say, look, that just doesn't square up with the way that I see things. So help me understand what you're trying to say, and so uh, we don't usually edit those out. That being said, I have not interviewed intentionally a white supremacist. I've not interviewed, somebody who is an extremist in those sort of senses, and so I'm not sure. Um, you know, a case by case basis, we'd have to figure out how to navigate that. But for the most part, what I've found is that people have brought their better angels to these conversations. That people have, um, the people who in some sense this project is self-selecting, because if I invite somebody to participate and say, we're looking for ways that we can live better together, well, sometimes there are people who say, no thanks, I'm not interested in that. And so in a certain extent, things are self-selecting. But when we do have that sort of conflict, or we run into strong differences during the interviews, we'll just address them. And there are ways that you can address them gently, that don't make people defensive, that instead let them open up and become vulnerable and share a really, a deeper story. And that to me, um, is where we get some really interesting insights.
Quick question: do you tend to do your conversations or your interviews or before you take the photos, or do you do the photos first?
Oh no, I always do the interview first. And I do that for a few reasons. One is that it allows that person to get comfortable with me. It allows us to build a rapport and build a little bit of trust. It also lets me sort of watch how they hold themselves. Do they look off to the side when they're talking about something serious? How do they hold themselves physically? And the third reason is because I learn things in the interview that can help inform me what we're going to do for the portrait. So when I interviewed Tyrone Wirtz, who had served 36 years of a life sentence for second-degree murder, and had been released about a year earlier, by the time we got to the end of the interview, I could say, Tyrone, I think it would be a really powerful image to photograph you out in front of the house where the murder happened. And that was a question that simply could not have happened if we hadn't spent this time together, sort of building a little bit of trust and a little bit of connection through the conversation.
You just gave one heck of a takeaway to, I think, for a lot of listeners to the show right there.
Let me just add to that one little bit, that I think this happens so often in our day-to-day experience, that we find that we have just a few minutes with somebody and we really get right into the fray, and we really get into those most contentious issues, and we jump right into the fire, and we get surprised when we get burned. And what we forget to do is that hard work of building relationship and building connection first, so that it offers us that opportunity to have a little bit of trust and move into those really difficult issues.
You definitely get more honest results, regardless.
I just wanted to add that the meaning of the interaction that John's talking about comes from people feeling like they're seen and heard. And that is the crucial interaction. That's what brings people together. I think we always like to think of the product, the photos, the stories that we then send out to the world. Those are representations of what can happen when we actually see and hear each other. But they're not the seeing and hearing. They don't substitute for being in front of someone, giving them your honest attention and your open mind and trying to see them with all the dignity that's inherent in them. And that's really what, when we talk about weaving, that's what weaving is. It's about being there for other people, seeing their full dignity, being willing to suspend your own thoughts so that you can really hear them. And you get a feel from that when you see John's work.
Okay, we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to be joined by Tonika Johnson, who's going to tell us all about the Folded Map Project. Stay tuned.
We hope you're enjoying this edition of the B&H Photography Podcast. The best way to support the show is by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. For links to gear and more information on today's guests, check out the show notes in your podcast app or visit our homepage on the B&H Explorer website and join the B&H Photography Podcast Facebook group. And now, back to the show.
Okay, we are back. Tonika Johnson is a photographer and lifelong resident of Chicago's South Side neighborhood of Englewood. She's also co-founder of the Englewood Arts Collective and Resident Association of Greater Englewood. Her art often explores urban segregation, documenting the nuance and richness of the Black community to counter media depictions of Chicago's violence. In 2017, she was recognized by Chicago Magazine as a Chicagoan of the Year for her photography of Englewood's everyday beauty. Her work has been exhibited at the Rootwork Gallery in Pilsen, the Chicago Cultural Center, and the Harold Washington Library Center. Her Folded Map project, started in 2018, visually investigates disparities among map twins, Chicago residents who live on opposite ends of the same streets across the city's racial and economic divides. And very important, the project ultimately brings these twins together to have a conversation. Welcome to the show, Tonika. I just read off a little idea of the Folded Map project, but how did something as common and mundane as folding a map evolve into such an intriguing endeavor? And before you answer that, I have to just throw in that when watching a video about it and reading about the project, I had a chuckle because at a previous residence I had, the town itself was divided between north and south by the main shopping avenue, and it was very linear, so it was all numbered streets. And I lived at an address that was like 222 North 2nd. I would routinely get the mail from 222 South 2nd to a point where we knew each other because we would drop off each other's mail, and it got to a point where we just text each other and just go incoming, knowing that in a few minutes something would be in the mailbox. And I had a similar relationship with the someone who lived at 222 North 4th. So it's kind of the same thing, but there was zero intention. It just came out of it. But I met two other people in my community who otherwise I would know nothing about, and it was a fun, casual relationship. Anyway, tell us about your map project. How did you figure this one out? How'd you connect these dots?
Oh, thank you for sharing your experience because that is kind of how the inspiration of my project began. Me actually experiencing meeting teenagers, kids as a high schooler from all over Chicago because I traveled 15 miles north from Greater Englewood to go to high school. And the high school that I went to in Chicago is Lane Tech, which is the largest Chicago public high school with a student body of 4,000.
Oof.
And yeah, exactly. So it's a little college campus almost.
Yeah.
And the student body was curated in the 90s, specifically 93 to 97, to reflect the demographic, the racial demographic of Chicago. Unfortunately, schools can no longer do that. But in Chicago, it was really great intention, because in order to kind of disrupt segregation, you have to be explicit about race. So I went to a high school with 4,000 students, and it was equal percentage of each race that's reflected in Chicago. So as a 13, 14-year-old girl on public transportation in 1993, where there is no GPS, no cell phones, you develop a relationship not only with public transportation, but with maps and understanding the numeric layout of Chicago's grid system. So basically, you had to know the map and addresses in order to get to where you were going. And the observations that I had on the commute, this was the first time that I was going out of my neighborhood every day to a neighborhood that was predominantly white and 15 miles north. So I was able to get familiar with the streets. And that was my first time realizing, oh, there's streets in Chicago that run the full extent of the city. And since I was situated in my home neighborhood of Greater Inglewood and my high school was just about the same distance west, I realized, oh, these are the same streets that are in my own neighborhood once I got to school. But it was really on that commute that I started to have the observations that would lead to me creating the Folded Map Project, which were observations like, oh, wow, I didn't know that my neighborhood had way more vacant lots than other neighborhoods in Chicago. The neighborhood that my high school is in has an array of businesses and cafes and flowers in the street medians, and my neighborhood doesn't. We don't have we have many potholes in the streets. We have an abundance of storefront churches. We have fast food restaurants only. And I just started to wonder, like, why is that? Like, I don't understand this. And then also just riding Chicago's train, I realized that, okay, by the time that I reach the train stop for my high school to get off at, the majority of people on the train were predominantly white. It had literally shifted from black to white. So these were all observations that would inform what I would become kind of fascinated about learning. And the ultimate inspiration for Folded Map and the concept of map twins, who are people who live on the same street 15 miles apart with similar addresses, but in racially, economically different neighborhoods coming together to meet, is because when I got to high school, I started to meet so many cool kids who I really felt like were reflections of me that I would become friends with, who were of all around Chicago, of different races, nationalities. And we learned together in those 4 years every day, asking questions that others could possibly view as offensive. But we were comfortable and we were naive and we just wanted to get to know our friends. Like, where do you live? Where do you hang out? And by the time we were juniors and seniors, we were hanging out with each other all over the city. And we quickly realized, how segregated the city is. Like, oh, okay, all of our white friends live here. All of our black friends live here. All of our friends from immigrant families live here. And so we knew without beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was our friendships, our relationships that allowed us to get to know the city in a way that most adults or Chicagoans get a chance to. It was only because of my experience in high school, this very carefully crafted, curated experience, that I was able to be a part of the beauty of Chicago's diversity and what it can allow you to understand about individuals, people who are different than you, and more about where you live and grew up. So all of that would snowball into a couple of decades later. Um, Me being inspired by the 2016 presidential election year, getting frustrated how Chicago was being spoken about internationally as a result of the presidential election year. I wanted to help people expand the conversation about Chicago's gun violence to actually include the history of how neighborhoods began struggling with gun violence. And so you cannot tackle an issue as severe as gun violence without the proper context of knowing how disinvestment, racism, and structural segregation really created the perfect breeding ground for those kind of issues to exist. And that's what inspired me to create Folded Map.
I've seen some of the work, and there's one image that stood out when it was one aspect of a street, and then another aspect of the street where there was a bus shelter, and it was a beautifully kept bus shelter, and then on the same street in South Side of Chicago, no bus shelter at all. And these are things that are so simple, so basic, and when you can point to the fact that one is like this and one is like that, it really is telling. But my question is, did it evolve from this kind of how would you say, like looking at the infrastructure with your photos to becoming a portrait project to some degree? And how did that happen? And when did you make it, when did you take that chance?
Yeah, so my love is photography. My passion for photography has inspired my inspiration to document not only my neighborhood but other people, and so it also influenced my decision to go to Columbia College and major in journalism and photography. So I'm a really curious and basically nosy kind of person. And photography allowed me an avenue to engage with people and neighborhoods as well as photograph them. And so originally, Folded Map was intended to only be a photography project. I was like, I'm just going to demonstrate and visualize what disparity looks like in Chicago structurally, not just through the lens of sensationalized issues, but just structural racism. And so I had already known streets that I wanted to compare. So that came very easy. And I was like, okay, I'm just going to photograph addresses that I know look very different but are similar. And I thought that was enough. I was like, that's going to prove my point. But some of the addresses include houses. And so as an artist, especially working on a project like this, you have to be honest about the limitations of how you're going to deliver it and the craft, the medium that you're using to deliver it. And it was to a point where I had realized photography was giving me too many restrictions to deliver this project in the way that I want it to the public. A photo can say a lot, but when you want to demonstrate structural racism, it was important for me to include snippets and videos of these actual spaces. But more importantly, I didn't realize that, me photographing homes, people might come out of the homes and wonder, what are you doing? Why are you taking a photo of my house? So that's exactly what happened. I was on the north side in a predominantly white neighborhood, and I am a, very visibly African-American woman with a camera just taking pictures of people's houses. And a woman came out of her house named Jennifer. And she asked me, hi, I just wanted to know, what are you doing? And I told her.
Was that how she phrased it? Or was that the tone of her voice?
And I told her. But when I started explaining my project to her, I realized my own what I was projecting onto her. I just assumed, I was like, she's not even going to understand this. She's not even going to care. This is just going to be pointless for me to tell her this because the project wasn't completed. So she didn't have a reference point. So I told her, I'm doing this project. Your house has a map twin on the south side. Like, this address actually exists on the south side. And she said, oh, that's right. I never thought about that. What neighborhood? And I told her Inglewood. And we just looked at each other, waiting to see how she was going to respond. And she responded so thoughtfully. She said, oh, I've actually never been to that neighborhood. And I said, well, do you know anybody from there other than me right now? And she said, unfortunately, no. Only thing I know about that neighborhood is what I've heard on the news. And just in the spur of the moment, what happens when you're doing a project, I just blurted out and said, well, would you like to meet someone other than me? And she said, sure. By the time she said sure, I was like, what have I done? I was only going to photograph addresses. Now I have to arrange people meeting. Oh my gosh. So I arranged for her to meet an Inglewood resident, because the concept of folded map is, if you were to fold Chicago's grid map at its 0 point, which is downtown Madison Street, the neighborhoods would touch each other, neighborhoods that are racially and economically different. And so I was in a neighborhood that was the map twin of my home neighborhood, Inglewood. And so those neighborhoods would touch each other. And so I wanted Jennifer to meet someone from Inglewood, and I arranged for her to meet Nanette, for Jennifer and her husband Wade to meet Nanette. And they came to Nanette's house, someone that I know from community work in Inglewood. And I just gave them prompts. Once they met each other, I introduced them and gave them prompts for specific questions, like tell each other how you came to live in each other's neighborhood. Describe your neighborhoods to each other. Is your place of peace in your neighborhood? What do you feel like your neighborhood needs and doesn't have? And the big adult question, how much does your house cost? How much did you purchase it for? And once I just gave them those prompts, they just started to have such a beautiful conversation that I was fascinated. They forgot I was in the room. And I just knew at that moment, wow, they're really getting to know each other. They started asking each other questions about hobbies, taxes. They discovered that they share the love of craft beer and organic gardening. And all of this came out from the prompts that I gave them. And that's when I knew I wanted to do more map twins. And that's when I officially started to call people who would participate map twins. And it was that moment that changed, or just expanded the project to include portraits, to include more video, and to really have me think about an immersive way for people to understand the macro um, layout of Chicago. So I knew I wanted to include a map of some sort of Chicago, so people can understand their geographic relationship to what they were going to eventually see, these portraits in these homes. So that is the evolution of the project. And it was really just a chance meeting someone who came out of their house, of one of the homes that I was photographing, for it to expand to include portraits and people.
What I really love about this whole project is that um, I think many of us come up with ideas for projects, not necessarily like this, but other projects that would have equal meaning to us. We don't really understand what vehicle should we take to make this happen. Now, what's wonderful is that this folded map turned out to be the vehicle to make all of this happen. This was the one little thing. This was the connector between the two. And often this is the kind of a thing that makes or breaks a project, makes it happen or just remain as a pipe dream. And you're fortunate that you stumbled on this and bright enough to have picked up on it, that this is my ticket. This is how I get where I'm going.
Yeah. I didn't know what the destination would be. I just knew that it was a project that I had been thinking about conceptually since high school. And the 2016 presidential election year made me want to just actively work on. And I didn't really anticipate or plan what the result could and possibly be, or how it would impact people. I just knew it was a perspective that primarily only a Chicagoan could really piece together, and even more specifically, a Black Chicagoan who has disrupted segregation because having to access amenities and resources that aren't available in my neighborhood. Myself, like many other Black Chicagoans, we see both sides. We become aware of that difference before a lot of white people who live in Chicago. And so I just knew that I had to get this idea out of my head to help Chicagoans at least break out of the normalcy, what we've made normal, Chicago segregation, and to really amplify the many ways actually that we disrupt it. And we don't even, give ourselves credit for it.
The name for the project, which immediately catches people's attention, as I found in just telling people about this episode. Did that come before you started the project, or did it come at some point as you were doing it?
It came as I was doing it, because obviously it's a multimedia project, rooted in photography and kind of, visual investigation. And so I found myself had so many layers, and I found myself having to explain it to people. And I was often saying, like if you fold Chicago's map, because for people who are aware of our grid system, like they get it as soon as I say that, like if you fold it, these neighborhoods would touch. So this is the way that the map is folding, is by people coming together, representing these neighborhoods, touching and meeting. And so I just said it so many times. I was like, you know what? It's just going to be folded map. Like it was really just because I was constantly saying it just so people could understand it. And that's what the title ended up being. I felt like, yeah, that pretty much explains it. That's what I'm doing through people meeting each other.
You use the word, or the words, visual investigation, and I love that phrase. But I'm curious, in your mind, of all the skills that photographers have to make something like this happen, and I include in that, the ability to talk to people and to bring out, the best in them, whether it's in a portrait or in a conversation. I mean, what do you enjoy the most? I mean, do you still look to the work as a photographer might when it comes to, lighting and composition and getting these images to tell stories, or is it really just more about the process?
The process for this kind of project and projects similar to it is very important in order to execute the photographic part. I think all photographers know, especially if you photograph people, that really the heart of the moment, once you have the technical skills down that you can easily execute, the heart of the moment is making your subject feel safe and enough to get comfortable in order to even capture their image. And so to me, that process is just as important as the technical aspect. But the technical aspect, you learn to adjust and adapt to different lighting situations, and you get familiar with your camera. And since I, was probably one of the last generations to have to learn on film, you know, you you know how to obtain all of your goals inside of your camera. And so at that point, it allows you to give a lot of more space to the process. And so the process of creating a really impactful and honest portrait is really what I used in creating this project. I just transferred the technique of getting your subjects comfortable. I applied that to the conversations that these map twins would have, which is making them feel safe, making them feel comfortable enough to have what could be difficult conversations. So it's both, the process and, actually taking the image, because your portrait won't be as impactful if people are not comfortable, if they don't feel comfortable around you or the environment that you're photographing them in.
It's like John referred to earlier on when photographing people. It's the last thing he'll do whenever possible, because everything else at that point is research, so that when you do press the button, you have a better picture, more
Yeah.
factual picture, and more honest photograph.
Yes. And, to the extent that when I was a teaching artist and would teach photography to young students, I constantly told them, your photos actually say more about you and how you view what you're photographing than that of your subject. And we get taught to believe that, oh, we're capturing the image of our subject, but we really are documenting how we view them, what we're paying attention to. And that's just important for for photographers to remember that the reason you have a portfolio is to show how you uniquely view what you're photographing. So your images and how you photograph someone actually says more about you than your subject.
Interesting.
That's a great point.
point.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Very good point. Thank you.
Quick, and where have you shown the photos? Where can people see them other than on your site, which we'll definitely get to that in a bit.
Oh,
But
thank
have there been
you.
exhibits and things?
Yeah, so my work has been exhibited. Right now, it's not currently exhibited well, actually, that's not true. I do have a project belonging that is currently exhibited at UIC's Social Justice Gallery. Near Roosevelt and Halsted. However, they haven't determined what the open gallery hours will be because of the pandemic. So, I do have a very lonely project that's exhibited right now. So, now that we seem to be emerging a little bit from the pandemic, hopefully I will have my work exhibited. But right now, it's primarily just on my website.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that this is, a very, very Chicago project, and of course we can understand that given the nature of the grid system in the north and south in Chicago. But it seems to me that it could apply anywhere. Have other people come to you or have to ask if they can do this in their towns, or
Oh,
have you
yes.
spread it out around the world yet?
Oh my gosh. So wherever there is segregation, you don't need a unique grid map. That was just, the personality of Chicago. There's always a fold, and you just have to find it. It's either a landmark, it's street, wherever segregation exists, there is always a dividing line. And so a lot of people, particularly in the Midwest cities, which shouldn't be surprising because that's where a lot of the legacy segregation exists, have reached out to me wanting to replicate folded map. And so I'm currently working on a find your fold guide that people can use to do folded map in their own location. And really what it's highlighting, or what it aims to highlight, is the value system of the project. Because I think it's very easy to understand the deliverables. You get some people from racially, economically different neighborhoods together to talk, and you photograph them, or you photograph some of the addresses. Easy deliverable. But it's the process again. It's who is involved. And so I really want to think through the value system of the project to explain to people that, it really should be in partnership and started with someone or an organization from the neighborhood that's most negatively impacted by segregation. If you don't have that, if you don't start there, the project could feel and look very different. And I wouldn't want any participants, regardless of what neighborhood they are from, to feel the burden of that. So it has to be in collaboration, and it has to be fully embedded in the understanding of the person or people from the neighborhood most negatively impacted. They have to be able to drive that. So that's what I'm in the process of creating as a result of people being so interested. I've even had people from other countries like, you can fold the world. You can use, all kinds of latitude, longitude. I was like,
Sure.
wow, okay, well, we're
Yeah.
not there yet, but
Yeah.
thank you for letting me know.
Well, it's a great idea. You just can't keep it down. I mean,
There's
come
just so many GoFundMes you could have out there at a given
I
time.
know, right? So many legs. So many legs.
Okay, according to the clock, we got to drop more quarters in the meter. It's time for us to go. We cannot thank our three guests enough: Michael Skoler, John Noltner, and Tonika Johnson. Thank you each very much. Let me go through the list here to get some websites and things. Tonika Johnson, if people would like to catch up with more of your work, more about folding maps and upcoming events, where can they go to?
Well, first and foremost, they can go to my website, tonikaj.com. That has all of my projects. But if they want to learn more about Folded Map, they can go to foldedmapproject.com. And then if they want to just stay in touch with me via social media, I literally live on Instagram, so they can find me there. My handle is Tonika J.
And all of this will be in our show notes, so it'll be easy to catch up on it. Again, Tonika, absolute pleasure speaking with you and hearing your story today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me.
Our pleasure. Michael Skoler, thank you to you for joining us today. And if our listeners would like to catch up with some of your work and events, where can they go to?
It's been a pleasure to be with you. And to find out more about the Weave project, you can go to weareweavers.com. And from there, you'll find a way to subscribe to our newsletter, to follow what we're doing in our projects, or to join our online community, our Weavers community. All of that's accessible from the weareweavers.org.
And if photographers out there have projects that they're working on and they'd like to share them with Weave, just to at least make you aware of what they're doing, is that something that's possible? I mean, I want to flood your inbox, but you know what I mean? Is that how this might work? Or should they start out by becoming a weaver first?
There's a contact form on our website. I would love to hear about projects of photographers who are trying to weave together their communities.
And John Noltner, if our listeners want to follow up on your work and your projects, websites, Instagrams, where can they go?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. I've really enjoyed the conversation. The website for the project is apieceofmymind.net. The important thing is that peace is spelled Peace. And, Instagram, we're at APOMM Stories. It's the acronym for A Piece of My Mind, APOMM Stories. And I'd like to encourage people to think about checking out our newest book called Portraits of Peace, Searching for Hope in a Divided America, which really sort of shares my backstory of this journey of discovery and challenging my own expectations and figuring out how to be a better ally in the process.
Sounds promising. Sounds good. Definitely going to follow up on that. And again, thank you so much for joining us. And all of this will be, again, in the show notes. Anybody wants to follow up on it. It'll also be amiss if we did not thank Todd Vorenkamp for suggesting today's episode. Todd is a coworker, a longtime coworker, great guy, and somebody who truly knows photography and understands its value. So, Todd, thanks again. If you listen to our show and you're not yet a subscriber, show us the love by heading over to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Google Podcasts, or wherever you snag your favorite shows, and sign up for free, and you'll know the moment a new show goes live. And if you're already a subscriber, leave a review. A positive one would be nice. The feedback is always appreciated. And you could always find us on the B&H Explorer website and on the B&H Photography Podcast Facebook group page. My name is Alan Weitz, and on behalf of John Harris and Jason Tables, thank you oh so much for tuning in today.